Well, welcome to another Discover Headless Tech interview from headlesscreator.com. I'm Marcelo Lewin, the Headless Creator. As always, get a hold of me right there, Marcelo at headlesscreator.com. Today's conversation is actually one I've been looking forward to for a while. It's really, really good. I'm looking forward to this conversation with Richard, which is my guest. I'll get him in just a second, but it's going to be all about the headless CMS industry, headless CMSes, the current state, where we're at today, where we're headed, and other insights. This is going to be a two-part series. This is part one. We have way too many topics and questions to go through, so we're not going to tackle them all today. As I mentioned, my guest in this interview is Richard Bausek. He's the principal product manager at Uniform. Previously, he was a senior product manager at Contentful, so he's got a lot of insight into the CMS industry. But before we get to the interview, you know how this goes. Go get your free account at headlesscreator.com. You'll have access to this interview on demand after we're done with it, but you'll also have access to the entire Discover Headless Tech course, as you see there, which includes not just lots of interviews. You can see we have many more interviews coming up, but lots of tutorials as well. And you're also going to have access, obviously, to the entire site, which includes the Content Modeling Weekly course, which I love to do, all the weekly tip courses, all the focus on courses, the bootcamp courses. We have more bootcamps coming on, lots of stuff, lots and lots of stuff. But with that said, we're going to go ahead and get started with our interview here. I'm going to bring on Richard, but before I bring him on, remember, for those of you watching live, in the chat, put in any questions you have, and I'll ask Richard. But with that said, Richard, welcome.
Marcelo, thanks for having me. Super excited to be here.
Glad to have you here. Now, I'm in Southern California. I believe you're in Berlin, correct?
Correct, yeah.
Thank you for joining me. I know it's a little bit later over there. Here it's very early in the morning.
It's
over
4 p.m. here, so it's fine.
4 p.m. Perfect time. The weather good over there?
A bit Berlin gray, but bearable.
Oh, okay. Well, it's better. I mean, we had some huge heat problems here in this area, so we finally have a cool down. Excuse me, but yeah, it's been kind of crazy. All right. I know the people didn't tune in for weather reports, so we'll jump into our interview. But before we get started, real quick, tell me a little bit about your background.
Yeah, sure. So I started in the early 2000s as a web developer and kind of been involved with content management systems like since back then. So I've been kind of dealing with CMS for 20 years. So was mostly working in agencies. Started off by learning PHP and MySQL by writing my own CMS back in the day, as everyone did.
Nice.
Back
with then. PHP, huh?
Okay. Yeah, it's writing a CMS from scratch is a good lesson to learn, like a backend language. And then I was involved, like implementing many kind of CMS systems. I was mostly working with Type 3. And so as I made my years through the agencies, I kind of moved more into a tech lead role. And so at my previous job, before I joined Contentful, I got very early involved into the headless world. That maybe also was due to the fact that one of my dirty secrets is I was a Flash developer. So I had a need to go multi-channel. So I have websites being powered by Flash, but also by HTML. And so kind of separating content from presentation was something I discovered quite early to be very valuable. And then in late 2018, I switched jobs again, like from a tech lead to a product manager, joined Contentful, and now in June this year, I joined Uniform.
Right. I remember the days of Flash. Those were not happy days. Flash was, I remember everybody wanting to do a Flash site, and then we realized it's horrible for SEO. This is just the worst thing in the world. And then I remember when they announced that we're killing Flash, which of course a lot of people were disappointed. So I guess we both go back a little bit way back. Yeah. We've been around the block. So at Contentful, you were a product manager, so you were involved in the creation of the product, right?
Yeah. So I kind of first started on the developer side of Contentful. So I was working on a team that was called Developer Workflows. So I was working on the environments feature in Contentful, the team I was working with, like we introduced aliases as a concept. So we were really looking into this operational side of migrating content, evolving content models over time. And yeah, later I kind of then moved more towards the editorial side. So one big feature we were working on was like introducing tags to Contentful. Then I spent 1 year building Compose, which is like the kind of more page-centric way of working with structured content inside of Contentful. And then I was part of a team that was focusing on content modeling. So there we worked on like smaller but hopefully valuable features like default values of field group support, and also making it possible to use any kind of content model inside of Compose and not kind of having a predefined content model.
I think that was when you ended up coming over at the end. You ended up coming over to Uniform. And at Uniform now you're involved in the Uniform product as a product manager, right?
Exactly. So I work on the Canvas, which is our kind of composition layer, or composition management tool, but I'm also looking into this next level of integration. So how can we make it super easy to integrate any data source, but also looking at it from the editorial perspective,
right,
and so on.
Right. Yep, definitely. Okay, so let's jump in. So not a warning, but a disclosure. This whole conversation is talking about where are we today as an industry. We, both of us, have been doing this for quite a while. I think a little bit over 3 years for me, probably longer for you from the headless perspective. So we're just, it's a lot of it is fact-based, some of it is opinion-based. This has nothing to do with any specific vendor. It's all about the industry, the tools, and how can we improve ourselves as an industry, right? So we've got a variety of categories, and we divided this into 2 parts because we just have way too much. But we're going to be talking about headless CMS technology. We're going to be addressing content, the pains that editors go through, how vendors can improve. We're going to talk about training, how enterprises can do better. Then we're going to tackle on composability, what is that, and then the future. So that's the sort of categories. So we're going to go randomly into all of these. So why don't we get started with where are we today, in your opinion, from a headless CMS compared to sort of the counterpart, the monoliths, right?
Mm-hmm. Like I would say, like headless went through a huge evolution over the last like 5 to 7 years. So where it kind of was first a tool for kind of tech savvy people, kind of really excited about how they can break free from the kind of constraints that they had from their more traditional monoliths, and kind of choose any kind of technology that they want. But maybe with a little bit of a downside for the editorial experience, but kind of giving a lot of productivity, a lot of advantages to the developer. And what I've seen now over the last years across multiple vendors, there has been really the shift for making it much more addressable, much more easier to use for content creators, but also looking at the more enterprisey kind of features like workflows, governance, making sure that you can manage content and users at scale. And so I do see headless maturing quite a bit. It really depends on which vendor you're looking at, but I think that there has been a huge kind of evolution there.
But as an industry, do you see, because you mentioned a lot of features and workflows and all that stuff, do you feel that the headless CMS, not vendor specific in general, all the headless CMS, do you feel that we are fully matured, or we're still defining and trying to figure out the best way to present the headless CMS?
I don't think it's fully mature yet. I think like people are still trying to solve many problems, like the editorial problems, and also maybe even the best way how to get the most value out of headless. But I think like when you were comparing more traditional CMS to headless, like the feature gaps got smaller between, or the functionality gaps got much smaller between those. And it also got more confusing because those traditional vendors kind of moved headless at the same time. So it's probably not an easy job today to choose a CMS.
Right. Well, and that leads me to my next question, which is from an enterprise perspective. do you feel that we have too many headless CMSs? Like there's large headless CMSs, like large companies, small companies, very small companies. There's a whole bunch, and it kind of reminds me of the internet days when the internet first took off, and you had thousands of companies, and then obviously it started shrinking, and bigger companies started eating up smaller companies. Do you feel we have, first of all, too many headless CMSs? First of all, and then second, do you think there's going to be this kind of acquisition within the industry where we're going to end up with like maybe 3 or 4 big ones?
Good question. So personally, I don't think there are too many. I think like having a wide variety of systems being a good thing. It's like good for innovation. It's also like every company is different. They have different content needs, they have different maturity needs. So some of those maybe smaller vendors are kind of the perfect fit for a small size team, but then you maybe have like large enterprise customers that really care about SLAs, they care about resilience, they care about like do they survive Black Friday, for example, where they have like millions of hits, and also maybe this kind of bigger governance issues. So like how easily can I bring my users into the system and out of the system? So I think it's very good to have this variety, also because the pricing points are very different for all of those vendors. I'm not sure if there's going to be this kind of acquisition phase. I think like maybe more if there are vendors that become more specialized for a certain job to be done that maybe another vendor is not solving yet. But I could see that happening. But I think like the majority of vendors, they more or less have the same functionality, some content modeling, some content editing functionality, and then kind of what you expect from Headless CMS.
So you mentioned pricing, and that's particularly a pain point for me as an end user, right? It's figuring out all the different vendors and all the different pricing models. Some, will charge you by number of locales. Others will charge you by number of content types, and there's all of these kinds of. It feels like almost the industry is experimenting with what is the best pricing model.
Yeah.
What's your take on that?
Pricing is a huge topic to unpack.
Yeah. But it's a huge pain point for enterprises because I remember. No, I was going to say my previous job, that was a huge conversation. Like, who do you go with, and why are we being limited? Things like that. So.
Yeah, and I think like predictability is probably one of the most important things that I think about pricing. So it should be easy for someone choosing a CMS to kind of look at it and kind of forecast into the future, saying like, okay,
exactly.
If the amount of content that I'm managing is scaling up with a certain size over the years, or the amount of users that I'm adding, like I should be able to kind of calculate that and kind of put that into my budget, because not all companies are very agile in their financing. And then especially in the enterprise sector where procurement is a really painful and long process, being able to predict what something will cost is really hard. And so there is often this kind of, I think like often customers or people, and especially enterprise, are probably overbuying. They probably buy more than they need because they just want to go through the procurement process once. But like my personal opinion is like Headless CMS should be usage based, so it's easy to predict. One personal pet peeve I always had is like content type based pricing, which I think is kind of going against the value of Headless CMS. Like you shouldn't limit. I think if you have restrictions or meters in your pricing, it should be based on the business value that you have, and that could be users, that could be locals, because you're entering new markets. So this has a business value for you. This is maybe enterprise features like single sign-on or similar kind of enterprise, or like audit logs, those kind of enterprise requirements, or data centers in a specific region. So I think like those are like the value drivers, and so those most Headless CMS should kind of really understand what brings value to the business and like makes it easy to explain. But kind of artificially limiting some entities, I think, in my opinion, that's very troublesome, because every project is different. You might have a very small amount of content or 20 locales, well, because you have a very small site, but you're going into 20 markets, or you might have a huge site, but only have one market. So it's really hard to get it right.
I 100% agree with you because content types are the basis of any headless CMS, right? I mean, that's where it all begins. Without content types, you don't have a headless CMS, basically. So limiting that to me is like almost limiting an engine on a car, right? Like, okay, you can't go faster than this speed, even though you really can. So I'm totally with you. I think pricing on business value makes definitely makes a lot of sense. Okay, so what about one of the realities that I've seen? I mean, we all talk about omni-channel delivery, which is, that's the goal for any headless, right? But there's a reality, which is we're still a page-centric world, right? I mean, I don't know what the exact stats are, but most people go to a web browser on a desktop to check it out, and second, they'll go on the mobile device, right? That's omni-channel right there, basically, in general, the majority. Do you feel that headless CMSs try to push this omni-channel, but companies really just want to use it as almost like a monolith CMS, right? It's like, look, we have a website and 90% of our traffic is there, so we have pages.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I think like it really depends, like what's the point in time in a company where you introduce a headless CMS. And what I've seen is like most often you have one very particular project or digital initiative where you kind of say like, we now need a new website or a new marketing page, and I also think like the maturity in many companies in regards to content strategy, to think about the big picture, like, okay, what audiences do we want to reach? What are the content formats that we want to use? What are the channels where we're going to reach those audiences? I've seen a big evolution in the last couple of years, especially in the bigger enterprises where people start hiring content designers and content strategists that help reason about that. But I would say like the regular company, they just say like, we need a website project and we use a headless CMS because it gives us freedom of choice for the technology and it gives us the delivery speed that we can get this project out of the door quickly. But I would say 99% of, or maybe that's too much, but in the majority of cases, your first headless implementation will be a very bad one because you don't really will understand like how to get the most value out of your content model and how you set up your project.
Well, but I think that goes to another issue, right? Which is lack of training to our customers, right? We are. I feel like we've done really good with developers. There's tons of documentations for developers on how to implement headless CMSs, and they get it, and it's wonderful. But I think there's also the lack of training of how do you implement a headless CMS versus a legacy? Because what I've noticed, and I'd love your take on this, is that many people will jump on the headless CMS bandwagon and then implement it as a legacy CMS because they now design a content model that is completely tied to design, that is completely page-centric. And every time they need to change something, they have to add a new content type. What's your take on that?
Yeah, and I think like absolutely. So I think this is really what I've seen happen so much. And this is really who's doing the content modeling. And so what I've seen a lot is because kind of often headless CMS implementations kind of don't require so much backend involvement. It's often a front-end developer that is doing some content modeling, and front-end developers are very much trained to kind of see visual patterns and turn those into components and see these kind of repeating patterns. But I think the main question that people forget to ask is like they see a hero or they see a card component, what content is flowing into that component, and where is that maybe a bigger, like the same content that you're having on a different page, and this is just like a different visual expression of that same content. So, and as you said, like people will just kind of take a page design, break it down into UI components, model that in a headless CMS, instead of kind of taking a step back and thinking, what's the thing that I'm showing? Is there like a domain object or behind that? Like some of the vendors actually do really good trainings. especially in the partner programs. But I think like probably all vendors could do better in the kind of for your regular customers that they get the most out of those systems.
But I think as an industry, we haven't done enough training for non-developers, like
Yeah.
retraining their thought process, right? And then looking, because I've been in so many content modeling sessions where they go, "Oh, we got a design system. We're just going to create, content types that tie to that design system." I'm like, no, don't do that, because now, so this goes to sort of like too much design-driven content modeling,
Yeah.
which I feel is, if you really want omni-channel, and even if omni-channel means a website, doing it to your design still will make it really hard for you to maintain and update your content. Because every time you switch stuff, your look and feel, you're going to have to throw away everything you've done and redo everything again, or at least update a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
Where if you really implement it as true single source of truth structured content, even if you only have one channel in your omni-channel plan, it's still going to be a great benefit for you. But I think that goes towards training or lack of training for non-developers. I mean, what do you agree, disagree?
Yeah, fully agree. Like this is something I've been kind of like, I think as a developer, that's something I did naturally when I first used a Headless CMS, and I always was a fan of domain-driven design. So for me, it was very natural to kind of start like extracting those kind of, I call it stable content versus volatile content, which is more the experience kind of content that you need. And so for a long time, it was really like hardcore. You can do 90% of your headless implementation just using stable content, and then let the front end decide what's the visual expression of that content.
Right.
But over the years, I kind of settled down a little bit on that kind of opinion. I think that you need both. You need this kind of like the experience modeling layer. Let's maybe call it this way. Like that's the kind of content type, like your pages or your layout elements. So you need to give your editors probably some way of placing content onto a page, maybe giving them a little bit of control, like what component should be showing that, which might be linking to a stable piece of content, like a card, or like a card might be linking to a person or event or blog post. And and you need a balance of both. And I think like the experience kind of modeling layer, that can be actually quite coupled to the design system, because it's a reflection of your current channel in this current point in time with your current design. But the way I think about the stable content on the other end is like, that's the content that will survive your next redesign or your next reskin.
Exactly.
Like that's the content you don't have to touch again.
Exactly.
And so kind of thinking about those is really, really important to get it right.
Right. And this is important for the industry to understand too, because what you mentioned, I think it's the best way to do it, right? Separate design, separate domain content. The problem then is you run into, we spoke about earlier, pricing structures and being limited on content types. Then you go like, well, yeah, that's the best way to do it, but I only have these content types and we just want to get a page up, and to create this page up and separate the design and the content domain, now I need 10 content types versus one for this page. And because I'm limited. So I think there's that disconnect between that pricing structure industry-wise and then the best way to implement a headless CMS. They seem counterintuitive.
Exactly. And I think like in my experience, like this kind of composition modeling layer, like the volatile content, that usually it's up your biggest chunk of your content types that you have in your plan. So you probably only would have like, I don't know, 10, 20 content types that express your business domain. But like often people kind of follow the atomic design principles from design systems and kind of model that one-to-one, and those design systems can get pretty big.
Right.
And so I think that leads to two very big problems. So there's very tight coupling to the current design, highly fragmented pieces of content, but those pieces of content are, I think, by its nature not reusable. So it leads to like very nested, very complicated authoring experience. So authors kind of have to drill into content very deeply to find like where do I update this call to action button label, or where do I replace that image? And then there's this explosion of content types that you will have.
Well, and I think this leads also to, in my previous job, I was a content architect and I was in charge of all the content modeling to make sure. And I think, and this goes to not just, not the industry, but more of the enterprises, partly in the industry too, that we're not pushing hard enough on having a content architect or a team
Yeah.
handle content modeling, right? Normally, it's sort of like an extra job for a developer, which
Yeah.
nothing against developers, but I don't think developers are the right people to do the content models. I think they should be involved in the content modeling
Yeah.
process, just like authors, just like you know,
Absolutely.
but I don't think you should be leading it. I think you need a content architect kind of leading that, being an evangelist for structured content. So what's your take on that? Because I don't think enterprises put enough importance on a person like that.
I've seen that with some enterprises that you're starting to hire those kind of people. Could definitely be more. And I think Chris Sanders from Simple A, he's been talking a lot about this content services organization, where basically you kind of form this kind of team in your organization that's really caring about the content pipeline, the content structure, the content strategy, content operations, and things like. One really interesting emerging field is like content engineering, like that team that kind of really looks into what's the kind of content that my organization is producing, where could we benefit from content reuse, and where can we maybe build out this kind of shared structures, and then maybe this kind of shared semantics maybe, or shared metadata or taxonomy that allows you to connect those that pieces of content together. I think it's probably a pipe dream to kind of say like an enterprise's content will be in the same place, or everyone will follow those kind of standards. But having like one team in an organization, or maybe if it's not a team, just having someone feeling responsible for content, that's super valuable. But it's probably also a very uphill battle for that person to implement those changes in a larger enterprise.
Oh, it is I can tell you personally, it's a great challenge, but of course, and this goes partly to enterprises and the silos that are in enterprises, right? Everybody is very siloed and everybody has projects they're working on and they all like, yeah, that's a great way to implement it, but we got to get this out now. So we're going to duplicate the content types and we're going to get it out now because we can't wait for that team to finish their project, right? So how do we either break down silos, or maybe I think as you put it when we were talking, connect these silos so they can work together better and understand how important it is to not have all this duplicate stuff and why it affects their enterprise in a bad way.
I definitely don't have the perfect answer for that, because I think like the whole industry and lots of consultants are trying to solve that. But my kind of take on that would be really focus on the customer journey. Think about in which phases of the customer journey do you need certain content, and then also think about the adaptation that a content will take for that particular audience. So let's say you may be describing like a feature of your product. You might have like then the same variation in your content that is maybe for technical audience, one for the non-technical audience. You might have different versions of your content, like a short form, a medium long form, and a long form. The consuming channel can decide what's the appropriate input or variation of the text to pull out and display. But then there's like the main other question, like content discoverability in the enterprise. So how do you even know that department B actually sits on a huge amount of valuable content, and how can we leverage that? So having
the content architect, right?
That's the content, like you need to kind of go into all of those departments and figure out, can we build shared content models? Can we build shared taxonomies? And breaking down silos is maybe not always realistic, but then maybe just thinking about how can you create bridges between those silos. Do those tools, let's say a department might be using Notion, one might be using Google Docs. Do those tools have APIs that allow me to pull together this information? Can I maybe have a content pipeline that kind of enriches that kind of content?
Well, let's talk about that, because you touched on something very important, which I remember when I was leading in the previous job. One of the things, and I don't know if vendors still don't understand how authors work. And I think honestly, breaking down the silos or connecting them, I think everybody should be mandated to be a content author. I think we don't put
Yeah.
enough importance on the value that a content author brings and the pains they go through when they're creating content, and more importantly, when they're updating their content, right?
Yeah.
That's when it's really the hardest work. It's not so much the
Yeah.
creation, but it's the updating of all content. And how bad it is when you have old content on your site, how bad it looks for your enterprise, right?
Yeah.
So let's talk about those. I mean, how can we help the industry understand better those pains? Because, as an example, most authors don't start in a headless CMS.
Yeah.
They start using a Notion document, or more commonly a Google Doc, and they do all their workflow there, and then they put it into a CMS, right?
Yeah.
So what's your recommendation for the industry to start recognizing the value of authors, to start putting up proper training for authors?
That's a hard one. So top of mind. So really teach your authors that maybe this day of what you see is what you get is over. Your content will go in many places, and maybe some places where they don't even aware that they will end up. So it's more important to author for the different variations, like I mentioned before, like having maybe different tone of voices or different audiences, different lengths there, and kind of also training the authors that it's worth this time. Because often, like I had this experience once when I was building a cooking website where we kind of went quite quickly omni-channel or multi-channel, but like the content model was quite convoluted. So the editorial team was like, oh my God, there are like 5 different description fields. You really have to put that in.
Right.
And so you really have to kind of sit down with them and tell them, this field will go there, this field will go there. This might be even a use case we're not thinking about, but we might support it in the future. So we are just ready by adding this structure beforehand.
Right.
And build up the trust that whatever rendering layer you have knows how to kind of make sure your content looks great, because it's not the author's job anymore to make sure content looks great. It's I had a friend once always tell me, when we were talking about what you see is what you get, she always said, what you see is a lie, because it will only look good for one specific context you're currently previewing it. You're currently previewing the content
At a specific resolution.
Exactly. So especially with responsive web design, like how does it look on mobile and
Exactly.
so on. So that's a really hard mental shift for content creators to kind of let go of that kind of control, and then teach them like what's the value of having this kind of structured content, because they will have less duplication, they will have less maintenance, there will be less business risk because you have outdated or inaccurate content, and really focus them on kind of creating quality content instead of caring about the presentation layer. Is that where you wanted to go? Or?
Yeah, no, totally. But that really goes to, so it's the industry has to kind of encourage this and evangelize this kind of new way of thinking on the content author side. Then, of course, on the enterprise side, you need a person to evangelize. A big part of my job, besides content modeling and architecting, was really evangelizing structured content and retraining the authors, right? So you need somebody in the enterprise to do that. But then you also need authors, content authors, to be open to this new way of thinking, because 99% of the time they wanted to bold, make a word red or make it bigger and control the design, right? And that's something that it's hard for them to move away from, because obviously with legacy CMSs, they've been doing that for 10, 15, 20 years, as long as CMSs have been around. It's always been that WYSIWYG, and they control everything, including the pixels and stuff. Do you have any tips of how we could retrain the authors into that new way of thinking?
I think one big challenge is kind of retraining them from thinking about how it will look like, but more towards what's the intent of this kind of content that you're having. So instead of turning something red and bold and saying like this is a warning message, your intent is like user should pay attention. So maybe this is a warning intent or an info intent, or emphasis intent. And so I think like that's what also the headless CMS systems should support, kind of authoring intent inside of those systems. And then again, it's up to the presentation layer, or maybe
Right.
even it's a voice interface. So maybe I have an emphasis intent, and then you're in a voice interface where the program just raises its voice, or maybe makes a pause or something else. So kind of, yeah, authoring for intent, I think like that's super, super important. But then also teaching the authors how this intent that they state in the systems is expressed in the presentation layer.
Yeah, intent is extremely important. I have a huge, multiple lessons on content modeling weekly on that. And I don't think the industry itself just teaches intent, right? We talk about content modeling and we talk about the content, but we never talk about what's your intent here. And I think that's once you explain it and, more importantly, demonstrate it, right? Like once you, like you mentioned, warning, right? Warning is better than big red, text, because a warning would be different in an IoT device than it is on a mobile device than it is on your, multiple omni-channel. And also when we think about omni-channel, we're not just talking, when we talk about, even if it's just web, but you still deliver a newsletter. That's another channel.
Yeah.
You may still deliver SMS messaging. That's a different channel, right?
Yeah.
So we do have multiples of that. So continuing on this topic of authoring experience and editor's paint, right? One of the things that I would love to see is a disconnect between the authoring admin interface and the actual content models in all headless CMSs, or the majority of them. Maybe I'm sure somebody's going to go, no, that's wrong. There's this one that doesn't do that. But in most of the headless CMSs, you create a content type and there's a counterpart form that is exactly that content, like that content type. But in general, you want to build a form that may be multiple content types, and you don't want to show every field of that content type because you may have fields that are for developer, right? And I know some vendors are trying to help you customize that, but it's still, I would love to see the ability to create content types, but then the ability to create my completely customized form.
Yeah.
Do you see us moving towards that?
Like you said, like I think some vendors have this ability or the beginnings of such abilities, and I fully agree. Like this is really important for the authoring experience, because you might have like a very complex domain model where maybe many parts of that content type are not actually managed inside of the CMS. You might have like a content enrichment pipeline that is adding metadata programmatically, and so hide that information from the like the author and just make them focus on the part that's part of their job. Or maybe you have a workflow where you maybe have someone creating a blog post, and then you have an SEO specialist that is just going in and caring about the 5 different SEO fields that they have to figure out or fill out. Or then it maybe goes on to the social media strategist that cares about, optimizing the Twitter card settings or the Open Graph settings and so on. So supporting those flows is super important. I haven't seen it too much. I've seen former customers trying to build solutions, but it's hard.
Exactly.
And in general, I think there's been some tweets going out in the content strategy world and Twitter last couple of days. There is not a lot of effort being put into the authoring experience anyway. So the first thing that's kind of being cut in scope is how do I really make sure that the authoring experience is well done? And so, so there's sadly not too much customization happening beyond maybe the capabilities of doing so.
Right, to customize, right, the authoring experience. But then now we're talking about the developers in an enterprise having to do that, which of course they're busy doing a billion other things, and that never gets done, right? So let's talk about the big one here. Authors say, I want to see before I publish, right? And we're talking about, well, we should retrain you, don't worry about it. But they go, yeah, good. But I want to see before I publish.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the big one, previews. That's the thing, the beautiful thing about headless CMSes, right? Is you can choose whatever you want. There's no head. You do whatever you want. The problem also is there's no previews. What do we have to do previews? You have to code them. You have to get developers involved. Let's talk about that.
Yeah. And fully agree, like preview is super important for authors and even to accept Headless CMS, because yeah, you can train it all the way you want, but in the end, you still want to see like, what's the artifact I'm creating? How will it look like? And so I think like if you have a very traditional website, it should be hopefully straightforward, but there are also some big technical challenges that I've experienced in the past. So, and that kind of more depends how you do preview. So the first decision you have to make is like the mode of preview. Like, do I have a separate staging server somewhere that is just my preview server that is consuming the preview API of the headless vendor? Do I run this on my production server and have some magic parameter that I add to your URL, like preview equals true, and you maybe have to password protect that? But then I think the biggest challenge is, when is content preview ready? Because if you use the preview APIs of most headless CMSs, they one step that they kind of miss is the validation step. So in my experience, and that's mostly from the agency days, you probably would spend 30-40% of the implementation to get the production side running, and then the rest of 50 to 60% you kind of needed to kind of get preview running, because your previously validated schema of your content model, where you could rely that certain fields were available, that's no longer the case if you're running against the preview API. So an editor could start building a page, opening up, don't fill out any fields, go on a lunch break, forget about this page. This empty page ends up in your preview server, and it's just breaking because in your code you're assuming that it has a title, it has an image,
Right.
and so on. So, and then it's like this balancing act as a developer that you need to, how much do I harden my application? Because then your code also becomes unmaintainable. It will have if statements everywhere. And another thing that I haven't seen yet in the headless CMS space, especially as more headless CMS now have scheduled publishing as a feature, is this point-in-time preview. So show me how my website or how my digital property will look at like a certain point in the future, or maybe even in the past, because I'm in a regulated industry and I have to show my auditors that we had this information on the website in a certain point. And I haven't seen that yet really being implemented, besides custom solutions that some customers build.
Almost like what is it called? The Internet Archive, where you can go back and see a page 10 years ago and things like that. You spoke of validation, and something came to my mind because this directly ties to omni-channel. But we tell our authors, look, let's just take a blog article, for example. You have title, body, we'll keep it simple, and author, right? That points to an authoring content type. The title will appear on the mobile app. It'll appear on a newsletter. It'll appear on the web. It'll appear on VR, whatever.
Yeah.
But each of those channels may have different validations, meaning that the title on the web could be 100 characters, but the title on the mobile app, we're limiting to 50. In most headless CMSs that I've experienced, you can't do that. If you're going to have a title for web and a title for mobile and a title for VR, and they're all different, and you want to put validations without doing manual validations, where you write a Google Doc that says, hey, these are the limits, which of course is not the best way to handle it. If you want to validate it at the authoring experience, you can't do that. Right? And that's something that is extremely important. I feel that we need, at field level validation, we need to have omni-channel, or the ability to add multiple validations depending on where we're delivering.
Yeah. Like, I think in general, there is no notion of a channel in any headless CMS, at least what I've seen. So I think that wouldn't even be possible now. Like, the way I've dealt with that in the past was just having multiple title fields and baking in those validations, and then training your authors to fill those in. And again, you can be strict about validation and force them to fill out all of those, or often what we would do is have some kind of fallback logic. So if it has short title, display the short title, otherwise fall back to the medium title. But that also can get like these kind of implicit fallback logics that you have in your front end can become very confusing for authors, because they're expecting something to show up, but something else shows up. So then you have to train them. What's your business logic that you've built into your front end application?
But it also goes against sort of the promise like, oh, your content is going to be much easier to maintain because now we have, let's say, 4 summary fields and they all have similar, but we have to change it a little bit because we got to remove a sentence here and there. And now you have to go change that field. Now you got to change it in 4 different places. And we haven't even spoken about, okay, now you have 4 different fields with 10 different locales. We haven't even touched that part. And by the way, Richard, we're at 46 minutes
Okay.
and we said 2 parts. I don't know, man. I may have to put you on the spot here and go for a 3rd part. Well, we'll see on the 2nd part. We've got so much, but this is fun. I don't know. I'm having fun here. This is great stuff. But let's talk about, I mentioned locales. Let's talk about a little about locales. What's your take? Where are we with locales in Headless CMSes?
I think we saw a little bit of evolution from basic translation management into more sophisticated localization. And so maybe being clear about the difference. So for me, translation is really this one-to-one translation from one language to the other, while localization is the adaptation of content for a specific region, which might include translating it to another language, but maybe it also might be translating into a local dialect. Or so think about maybe French, Canadian French and normal French. Probably the same language, but they might be using different kind of words or ways of expressing themselves. I'm definitely no expert in French, so but you get the gist of it. And so one thing I've seen quite a lot is like the ability to independently publish a locale. Some systems have good ways of localizing in some way, but it's always this mix between translation and localization. So there are probably each system, what I've seen, has their own workarounds or best practices to deal with localization and translation. But to be honest, like I don't think any system is nailing it yet. But also in the old world, like localization is super hard to get right.
Right, and there's also the automation of that translation, right? Because in a perfect scenario, you automate and then you validate with humans, right? Because machines, smart as they are, they still can't put in context. Your example is perfect about France, but I can give you an example in the US. Even within different states, you may have, one way of saying it in California, another way of saying it in Texas, right? And may mean different things. So really getting it localized, especially for a website that really wants to sell to a particular locale, a particular location, right? They want to be able to do that. So I think better tools for translating, validating, localizing, right? Those are all very, very different things that need to be done.
Yeah. And I think like the localization market, like the translation tools and the localization tools, they are really maturing. And also the integrations into the headless systems are quite sophisticated. I think like one big challenge is rich text, where every system just has their own rich text format. So for each translation service provider, they kind of have to learn about the like the specialities or the special format for each of those vendors. I'm not saying like that JSON-based rich text. I actually think it's a good idea, but it definitely makes translation much harder.
Yeah. And beyond that, localizing images, right? We haven't images or even video. We haven't touched about media, because media in itself, and it's not just translating the text in an image, right? Because you can do that with image transformation APIs, right? Where you can add image, but even changing the actual image, right? It may be a different person that you need or whatever. It may be something different. So localizing that and having the tools for that, because localization and translation can get very complex in an enterprise. Definitely. Okay, I'm looking at all the questions here. I have a lot more questions, but I mean we're pretty much here at the end. We're going to be covering many more questions in the next in part 2. I do want to close it up with a lot of the stuff we've been talking about is really focused on enterprises. What's your take on headless CMSes and SMBs and even small business?
Excellent question. Let me quickly think about this one.
And I know I put you on the spot on that one, but but I mean,
I think it depends on the maturity of that company. Like it could be a small startup or maybe a small brand that is omnichannel ready. You kind of understand that you have to reach multiple channels, multiple audiences. So for them, it's probably a very good choice to go headless early. And also maybe there are some really good headless CMS on the lower budget side of things that kind of will serve your business for quite a long time. But yeah, you really should be thinking about like, what's your digital strategy? Is it web only? Then probably you're fine with Webflow, Wix, I don't know. I shouldn't name vendors, but this kind of page builder kind of like solutions, not the traditional headless CMS.
Well, yes, I'm with you, and I think as vendors think about small business and SMBs, they need to think about how do they really work, because in a traditional headless CMS, right, you need a developer team. You need a developer team because you can't do anything without developers, right? But maybe, and I hate this term, the out of the box, templates or something, but maybe, market or implement the ability to do structured content, but with templates already provided to them, which I know goes kind of against the headless because we're not going to give you templates. But for small businesses, the benefits of structured content is huge. It doesn't matter if you're a mom and pop shop. If you do structured content, it's great. But what they don't want to do is they don't want to do the coding. They don't want to hire developers because maybe they have no knowledge how to do that. Where do you even start? And second, it may be too much money for them, right? But if you provide that head already for them, decoupled, but provide them that head, and then teach them about structured content, I think they can get the benefits of headless CMS with sort of the benefits of that template-driven, design that came with a traditional CMS.
Yeah, but only until they want to make the first modification. Then they kind of depend on on the developer.
But it gets them in, gets the foot in the door.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, totally. Okay, Richard, it's been a pleasure. I'm looking forward to part 2. I think it'll be fun, and maybe part 3. I don't know. We'll see.
Okay.
If people want to get a hold of you, what's the best way?
I lurk on Twitter, as you see my handle here on the screen. Same username on LinkedIn if you want to reach out. Yeah, I think that, or Richard B at uniform.dev if you want to reach me with email.
Excellent, Richard. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks to the rest of you. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. We just want to talk about the reality and how can we improve as an industry. That was the whole goal of this interview, and I think we tackled a lot, and we're going to be tackling more for part 2. We are very, very happy to be in this industry, but like all industries, right, we can always improve and do better for everybody. So anyway, as always, get a hold of me right there, Marcelo at headlesscreator.com. So again, I hope you enjoyed it, and until the part 2, we will see you soon. Cheers.